joy in trials, sees beyond the moment and says, this, especially this, is making me more like Jesus.
This is Mission 66, taking you through the Word of God from the ministry of Bible teacher and pastor, Dr. Luis Sayao. In partnership with Transworld Radio, Mission 66 is produced and heard around the world in several languages. Let's hear from our teacher, John Matthews, and his co-host, Esther Sasulu, as they start us off today in our survey of God's Word.
It is so great to have you with us once again as we read the Bible chapter by chapter and see what lessons we can learn from it. And I'm excited today as we continue our recent look into the book of Psalms, focusing on Psalms 38 and 39. Now, friend, if we're being honest, the faith walk, following Jesus Christ, it's not always sunshine and roses. And basically that means it's not always easy. And you know, David learned this in his day as well because he had to go through many dark valleys before and after he got to the throne. Well, as we look into the Psalms, our teacher John Matthews will bring us the theme, Burning with Fever.
Esther, thank you so much, and a very warm welcome to this latest episode of Mission 66, wherever you are today and whatever your situation. It is so good to have your company as we reach Psalms 38 and 39. Now, look, most of us, I think, will have had some experience of sleepless nights. You know what it's like at that moment when we feel as though our body most needs rest, but we're overwhelmed with thoughts maybe and concerns about all manner of concerns that we face in this life. And as we toss and turn and roll from one side of the bed to the other, because of those sorrows and complicated life events, we are living an uncomfortable reality that is common actually to all mankind. And today we're going to see David experiencing something similar to this in these two Psalms. And yet we're going to learn a lot as we make our way through these verses about how to break a fever and how some of David's greatest life lessons are learned here in the midst and during the pinnacle of his suffering. Psalm 38, well, that is a Davidic psalm and a petition, and we see exactly that in the first verse. So let us read Psalm 38. O Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath. For your arrows have sunk into me, and your hand has come down on me. There is no soundness in my flesh because of your indignation. There is no health in my bones because of my sin. For my iniquities have gone over my head like a heavy burden. They are too heavy for me. And then verses 5 to 10 detail the very real physical consequences of David's sin. Verse 5 says, my wounds stink and fester because of my foolishness. I am utterly bowed down and prostrate. All the day I go about mourning, for my sides are filled with burning, and there is no soundness in my flesh. I am feeble and crushed. I groan because of the tumult of my heart. O Lord, all my longing is before you. My sighing is not hidden from you. My heart throbs, my strength fails me. And the light of my eyes, it also has gone from me. And verse 11 through to 20 outline the consequences of David's sin on his relationships with those who were close to him and those not too close as well, his opponents who've seen an opportunity to take advantage or to try and take advantage of him while he is in this weakened state. Verse 11, my friends and companions stand aloof from my plague, and my nearest kin, well, they stand far off. Those who seek my life, they lay their snares. Those who seek my heart speak of ruin and meditate treachery all day long. But I am like a deaf man. I do not hear, like a mute man who does not open his mouth. I have become like a man who does not hear, and in whose mouth are no rebukes. But for you, O Lord, do I wait. It is you, O Lord my God, who will answer. For I said, only let them not rejoice over me, who boast against me when my foot slips. For I am ready to fall, and my pain is ever before me. I confess my iniquity. I am sorry for my sin, but my foes are vigorous. They are mighty, and many are those who hate me wrongfully. Those who render me evil for good accuse me because I follow after good. Do not forsake me, O Lord. O my God, be not far from me. Make haste to help me, O Lord, my salvation.
Whew, wow, that is incredibly heartfelt. You know, you can almost hear the pleading in David's voice in these last two verses, John. There clearly is this unmistakable urgency, and I guess that there are those who may be listening to this episode who resonate with this, you know, who are facing situations that are just incredibly tough.
Yeah, you're right there, Esther, so right. This cry, I think, is right. As you put it in verses 21 and 22, it's directed to God in the full hearing as well of the community, reflecting David's need for help, but also his belief that God would hear and indeed answer the cry of his heart. So what is David doing here? Well, he's actually doing two things. Firstly, this is a powerful lament and plea to God for deliverance from trouble, which in this point of David's life is a result of David's sin. And then secondly, David recognizes clearly that God is the only source of forgiveness, the only source of hope and deliverance available, not just here, but full stop. And the same is just as true right now, today, as it was then. And we may feel as though there is no hope for us because of the things that we have done wrong or because of our situation. But that is not the truth. And David knows the truth. And so he calls to a God who is for us. In the very first verse, David says to God, Lord, do not rebuke me in your anger or discipline me in your wrath. And verse 2 completes that thought by saying, your arrows have pierced me and your hand has come down on me. So there is no doubt, Esther, and our dear listeners there today, that David is suffering deeply. And this suffering seems overwhelming. And so he is indeed having to break a fever and learn to live with his own very obvious, in this point in his life, his very own natural limitations. He's suffering terribly, and he understands that this particular suffering originates in God. As described in verse 3, he's saying, because of your wrath, there is no health in my body. There is no soundness in my bones. Why? Because of my sin. My guilt has overwhelmed me like a burden too heavy to bear. Now, those who believe in God will also know that it seems far easier to worship God in the moments of plenty, when everything seems to be going well in life and we're experiencing that perhaps warm glow that accompanies the good moments. We long perhaps for bad experiences to bypass us, for us to somehow avoid tragedy and upset and trauma as far as we possibly can. But boy, is life unpredictable and unknown. And so the question arises clearly, what about those moments when things are not going to go well? When difficulty and pain, as it inevitably does in life, knocks at our door? Is God going to leave us then? Well, there is a beautiful truth revealed again to us here, that this God is still God. And this only God is goodness itself. In fact, he is perfectly good. And he creates this piece of poetry which is transformed then into a hymn of lament. And it teaches us some important things. And when the presence of God, we allow the silence to fall and the presence and the voice of God to be heard in this moment, it is so much greater than even that warm glow of the good times, so much greater. It's that sense of being known and held and heard and understood and loved completely. And we know that we are complete in the one who created us and knows us better than we know ourselves. Our Creator, our Saviour, our forevermore. And in this passage we see that David, well, his body is sick, and the point is referring to his health here. If we look at verse 5, we see actually a medical explanation pretty much for what's happening when he says, "My wounds fester, and they are loathsome because of my sinful folly." Verse 7 says, "My back is filled with searing pain. There is no health in my body." He's in a bad way here. He goes on to say, "I am feeble and utterly crushed. I groan in anguish of heart." David feels his sickness, and somehow he understands that this sickness that is overcoming him is related to his sin. Verse 3, "Because of your wrath, there is no health in my body. There is no soundness in my bones because of my sin. My sin, my guilt has overwhelmed me like a burden that is just too heavy to bear." And there are tough moments in life when we feel sick, when we face the reality of guilt and the experience that the results of our sin and the things that can become worse when these moments of sickness, guilt and sin are accompanied by solitude. But look here and listen carefully to the sadness that we find in verse 10 and 11. "My heart pounds, my strength fails me, even the light has gone from my eyes. My friends and companions, they're avoiding me because of my wounds. My neighbours, well, they stay far away." And as you listen to Mission 66 today, I know you, dear listener, may well have experienced moments like this, like these moments that David is going through. And in the moments of greatest difficulty, in the moments of pain, of sickness, of guilt, of suffering, this, it may seem, is when many of our friends disappear. Perhaps this has been when your neighbour turns the other way because they want to have nothing to do with you when the difficult moments come. Maybe they have no idea what to say to you. And it is sad to see some people only interested in taking advantage of a situation. And so when difficult moments come and there is no advantage to be gained, they disappear. What do we do when we're faced with not just the pain, but the isolation, the loneliness? Well, David here completely pours out his heart to God, and he tells God of his pain. And at the end of the psalm, he says, "For I'm about to fall, and my pain is ever with me. I confess my iniquity. I am troubled by my sin." So he cries out in pain, and he asks God for help, because God is his only hope, much as he is our only hope now, today. He says, "Lord, do not forsake me. Do not be far from me, my God. Come quickly to help me, my Lord and my Saviour."
Well, John, I know that you're shortly going to pick out just some key verses from the following psalm, Psalm 39, but I really do have some burning questions that I need to ask. Now, reading through these psalms, it seems that there is very little but lament and sorrow in these psalms. And it really just got me thinking, well, isn't God a God of joy and a God of blessing? I imagine that a lot of us would expect to read that in the Psalms. But, these Psalms have this unmistakable resonance of depression and sadness about them. So how can we explain this? Why is there just so much sadness?
Well, Esther, I think that, one of the things that we need to understand and remember right now and here is that God is an absolute God. He's omniscient. He's omnipresent. He's omnipotent. That means he's all-powerful as well as everywhere at the same time. He's a God that has the possibility and the capability to have a relationship with us, despite the fact that he's so elevated. And he understands better than any of us do the different spheres of life. And if we imagine and think that God is only a festive God, a God of the happy moments, then what will happen to many of us when the time of suffering comes? Well, we may well go to think or believe that God has left and ceases to exist, and that God is actually of no use in a practical sense during the tough times. And so this psalm, well, it's important because it shows us that in the toughest moments of anguish, of depression, of sadness, of sickness, of pain, God is not just still there. He is all there. And he is our source of hope in those moments. In fact, there is no hope in those moments apart from him. So God is not only God in the happy moments of life when things may seem to be running smooth, but he is God in the difficult moments. And we see here then this example of the wholeness of God.
Well, this is truly resonating with me, acknowledging God once again in those difficulties, but also in those good moments. He's there with us. Now, John, let's take a look at the description of the psalmist here. What sort of illness could he be experiencing? Because he says that his wounds are festering, that he's feeble and he's crushed. Oh, that really sounds like a miserable place to be in. So, what sort of sickness is this, and how can we understand this moment?
Yeah, it's an intriguing question, Esther, and actually we can't be 100% sure because there is plenty of poetry here, and there's also a description as well of his psychological state, David's psychological state. So what can we then objectively say, or how can I objectively answer the question you just asked me? Well, look, David says that his illness is affecting his entire body and that he has no health. He says he feels feeble and crushed, and that his body is in pain. And if you were to look upon him, you would see visibly festering wounds. Verse 5 says his wounds are loathsome. Verse 7 says his back is filled with pain, searing pain, no less. And the proper translation here would be to say that he is burning with this fever. So, look, everything indicates that he's got wounds on his body, all over his body, and a high fever, probably an infection. So we don't exactly know how all this came about, but there's no doubt whatsoever that he's very ill. High fever, something probably caused by an infection that generates this incredible discomfort that he describes here. And so his attitude, actually, Esther, is of somebody who's near death.
Wow, those verses definitely give a very vivid description of what he's suffering through. And when we read Psalm 38 from the start, it's quite clear that this man is sick and that the cause of his suffering, at least here, is said to be sin. Now, I think a lot of us are wondering, John, do we still suffer today, sometimes as a result of our sin and the things that we do wrong? Are these the kind of consequences that we might expect?
Well, look, Esther, that's a serious question. And we are not sure, actually, if the illness here described is the result of a sin. David acknowledges that he feels that it is this that has brought about his suffering because he feels guilty. It's not confirmed here by the only person who is able to judge, and that, of course, is God himself. But we know just by reading quite clearly that David is under that impression. That is the way he feels. He feels that this situation has come about because of things that he's done wrong. His sin, that's the word the Bible uses for the things that we do wrong. And look, this is something that happens to us as well, right? In times of pain and suffering, we may well recall our sins. It's possible. But look, in this situation, David attributes his suffering to his sin. Very often, that is not the way for David, and it's not the way for us. But here, this is how he feels. And so it's not impossible that illness is sometimes the result of sin. Even in the New Testament, we will see the idea that people do get sick and die as a result of their actions. But we've got to be very careful, I think, about that, and certainly not make generalizations, because it's also very clear that suffering is and accompanies faith in Jesus Christ. So it's a very careful line that needs to be trod there. And more often than not, it's not because of sinful actions. But if we look at the idea of actions leading to consequences and the idea of reaping what you sow, it is probably fairly straightforward to understand that somebody who's sort of wantonly, let's say, lives their lifestyle in a promiscuous way, and there's a whole host of reasons why they might do that, and often that may relate to their experience in life, so there's no judgment when I say that. But if you live your life a certain way, or you're addicted to drink or to drugs or something, or pornography, then it leads to certain consequences in your mind, but also in terms of your health. And if we know that there is a way to do things, and we don't do those things, but we live in a way that puts our health and our lives at risk, well, there is a consequence that may accompany that as well. But the great news is that God is full of grace. He understands that we're very often damaged people and weak people as a result, sometimes of our background, sometimes because of generational sin, but ultimately because we are all sinful. Every single person is born into this world a sinner. And so we have this weight of sin that is a burden on our backs that needs to be lifted. And that is our responsibility to come before Jesus. And we can't blame everything on other people or on generational cycles, even though they play a part. But it is just that, a part. And so back to what we're talking about here, This relationship between sin and sickness, yes, it's a possibility, but we also need to understand that not every sick person, far from it, faces illness because of something that they've done. No.
Yeah, that's a great word, John. Thank you so much for that. And, just thinking about Psalm 39, it's almost like a prequel to Psalm 38, isn't it? But there we also find, once again, lamenting, lots of lamenting. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, you're quite right. And here the psalmist presents us with a meditation, really, about the idea of the righteous and the way that the person who is right before God actually thinks. And as he does this, Esther, he then reflects a little on the situation of mankind, of the human being, on justice, and indeed on his own suffering in this world. Verse 2 says this, "So I remained utterly silent, not even saying anything good. But my anguish increased, my heart grew hot within me. While I meditated, the fire burned. Then I spoke with my tongue. Show me, Lord, my life's end and the number of my days. Let me know how fleeting my life is." And in this psalm, then, we see the reality of the results of suffering in life. We see how this suffering can cause us to having this attitude of stopping and reflecting and thinking more deeply and having the wisdom to deal with the reality of life. Sometimes that happens the older you get, and you stop and you sense and feel the brevity of life, and you see that the ways that you've been doing things, they don't work. They don't ultimately bring you that deep peace and belonging to Jesus Christ, to a God who created you and whose life is in his hands if you place it there, which is perfect stillness and belonging and knowing where you're going. That's the way to deal with the reality of life. But the psalmist is experiencing here, and is going to experience difficult moments, as we heard in Psalm 38, where he's beset by sickness. The memory of past sins are haunting him, and those mistakes, and his current feeling of being abandoned, of isolation and loneliness. And then here in Psalm 39, we also see the difficulties that we have in life or living with enemies, revealing that we need to break fevers, and that as life teaches us our natural limitations, well, that knowledge then has the potential to lead us to real wisdom, the gift of wisdom from God even. I don't know if you've ever spent some time in hospital. Well, you could almost describe that as a sort of university that we go to, and we experience suffering in hospital. And boy, is that a time where we reflect on our own weakness and mortality very often. And we sometimes instinctively then ask ourselves the questions, why is it that I have such unfounded confidence, that I'm even arrogant? Why do I treat others badly and many times judge and disrespect and lack respect towards them? Why is it that I treat some people in a discriminatory way and treat people differently? Why do we do all this? Why do I do all this when I know that I should not be doing this? And the answer, of course, is because we've lost our perspective on life. Maybe we've never had that perspective, that eternal perspective. But being in that university, that hospital, faced with our own fragility and mortality, well, look, it gives us, and it can give us, major life perspective. And it may be the place where we see clearly our own weakness, because it's unavoidable, our own limitations as imposed by the natural world. And here we see the psalmist, well, he begins noticing these things. He says in verse 4, "Show me, Lord, my life's end and the number of my days. Let me know how fleeting my life is." because you have made my days a mere handbreadth. The span of my years is as nothing before you. Everyone is but a breath. That's it. That's life. But a breath. Even those, it says, who seem secure. What a verse that is. It is incredible when you read that verse and then you compare it to the reality of the history of Western culture and what we see around us today. Mankind believing that they are capable of anything and everything under the guiding principle and evolution of reason and technology, yet finding himself in increasingly deep waters with worse nightmares becoming a reality because of war, rampant injustice, and the rise of what seems to be unmitigated evil, destruction, sometimes like a free-for-all amongst some leaders in our world and amongst some people. And so this culture, this society is now prone to feel like it's in a sort of hangover due to the deep disappointment and the unfulfilled promises. And we see a society that has not learned to recognize and realize that human weakness is a reality, as is the limitation on the days of our lives, and that without God, we live ultimately in a world of false promise, a world ultimately of despair. Sometimes we try to run away from this and we may live in isolation or alienation, or perhaps we self-anesthetize and we focus on sex, on drugs, on a surreal world that doesn't exist. And we run away from reality without understanding that accepting our limitations is crucial. In fact, it's so healthy because it then shows us our limitations, our vulnerability, our need for something and somebody so much greater than ourselves, who offers us so much more than is available in and of ourselves and certainly in the world around us. And the psalmist then reveals that with God, boy, are things so different. Verse 6, he says, man is a mere phantom. In vain they rush about, heaping up wealth without knowing whose it will finally be. But now, Lord, what do I look for? My hope is in you. My hope is in you. Save me from all my transgressions. And then verse 9, I was silent, I would not open my mouth, for you are the one who has done this. Remove your scourge from me. I am overcome by the blow of your hand. When you rebuke and discipline anyone for their sin, you consume their wealth like a moth. Surely everybody is but a breath. Now, the face of this reality, the reality that whether we recognize it or not, the truth is we will never escape our own weakness. When we break our fever and discover that we have our own limitations which are imposed by nature itself, we are no longer under this illusion. And that happens when we face difficulties without escaping the reality of God. And the psalmist will end the psalm in an interesting way here in verse 12 and 13 when he says, hear my prayer, Lord. Listen to my cry for help. Do not be deaf to my weeping. I dwell with you as a foreigner, a stranger, as all my ancestors were. Look away from me, that I may enjoy life again before I depart and am no more. And this psalm shows us there are difficult moments in life and there are moments of joy. Here the psalmist points out the desperate need that we all have for a relationship with God, a need for asking and asking God for mercy and for humbling ourselves. And with this tough reality that we face in life, how do we deal with it? Well, the answer is that we must never forget when the most difficult moments come our way, as they will, when everyone leaves us and disowns us, as may happen, you've got to do two things. We need to learn to meditate and understand and reach for the essential truths of life. And as we do that, we will understand, if that is our heart's desire, who God really is. And he will help you to not lose hope, because he is our hope. He's not just our hope for now. He's our hope for the moment you die and enter eternity, because the day you die is the beginning of eternity forevermore. God is our only hope. He alone is our only safe and true refuge. But he is also our only safe and true refuge when all is going well. There is none like him.
Okay, John, I don't want it to seem as though I'm pushing too much here, but, these verses, they say that God is the one who caused the psalmist suffering. So I have to ask, why does God do this to us?
Well, Esther, that is something important to look at. When we suffer, and we do suffer, for example, with sickness, we suffer with loneliness, isolation, other problems, psychological problems, we sometimes can develop really dangerous attitudes. The first one is to say, well, look, this is somebody else's fault. And we can become embittered with the world and everyone around us and find 100 reasons to blame other people for the way we feel. But the second is to say, well, look, I'm just useless and worthless. I'm a bag of trash. And we blame ourselves for everything, and we just allow ourselves to slide into that miry pit, and maybe depression, deep depression, follows as a result of that. And the other complicated attitude is to simply think, well, everything makes absolutely no sense. There's no logic to it. Life is this way just because it is. There is no explanation. So free for all, I am going to live my life as I please and do as much stuff as I can do. Now, there's a tale therein, a little bit of the prodigal son who goes away and does as much as he can do, but actually he comes to an end of himself and realizes that everything that the world offers, and he tries pretty much everything, it doesn't meet his deepest need, and so he comes back to the Father. And my prayer is that we come back to the Father who awaits looking down that road with open arms. You know what the psalmist does here, actually, as I say this? He does something quite interesting, Esther, because he knows, does the psalmist as he writes, that God is the Lord, that everything belongs to God. Even those negative experiences, well, they needed at least divine permission. They're not caused by God, but they needed his permission. And that is important, because during this moment of pain, we cannot lose our expectation for God's blessing, for his blessing. We know that God exists, and God allows us the free will to come to him or not. That is our choice. But he allows these things to happen, bad things, sickness and suffering, and that is a direct result of him giving us free will, as well as the reality of human nature that is blighted by sin until he returns again. So he grieves with us when sin goes wrong, but the devil is allowed to roam so that we have this free will to choose or not choose him. There will come a time, though, when God calls time on this earth. We don't understand it, and we may not understand it this side of eternity. Maybe we do. But God is ultimately wise and full of goodness and love, and he brings good from bad situations. And perhaps at least one thing that we need to be aware of is that only when we experience suffering, well, it's only then do we really learn empathy, and it deepens our compassion. It's only then that we truly understand just how frail that we really are and the limitations that we live with as humans.
Oh, wow. Well, this episode truly spoke to me, John. He brings good out of bad situations. And so we trust God in the midst of our suffering. Well, thank you so much for leading us through the study. Let's get right into the summary of today's episode.
Well, today, Esther, our theme was breaking fever. One thing we need to learn is to recognize our limitations that are imposed by nature, and that God is the only one who can do everything. He is the Lord. And we're weak, we're limited, we're fragile, subject to infirmities, to the difficulties of our reality here on earth. And when we experience suffering and pain and we become aware of who we truly are, it's the greatest perspective giver in many ways. And James encourages us in the New Testament. He says this: count it as joy when we meet trials of every kind. It seems impossible sometimes when we read that, and it's certainly not pretending that pain feels good, but it is about trusting that it is doing something good in us. So when we face hardship, loss, it's then that God has the biggest chance to shape our characters, to deepen our faith and draw us closer to Him. Joy in trials sees beyond the moment. It says, this, especially this, is making me more like Jesus.
Well, dear friends, I want to thank you so much for joining us for this episode. We look forward to joining you next time, same place, as we continue to explore the book of Psalms. Now, friends, I would also like to thank you so much for your prayers and for your financial partnership with Mission 66. This really allows us to reach listeners around the world in multiple languages. Now, if you have it on your heart to give to the ministry, please do visit mission66.org. That's mission66.org. Well, I'm Esther for John and our team saying we'll see you next time. May God bless you.
As Mission 66 comes to a close, be sure to download your free study guide at mission66.org. Deepen your daily devotion with insights from each episode, and let John and Esther lead you through the Scriptures. Get your study guide at mission66.org and be prepared for our next episode. There, you can also connect with us, ask questions, or donate to help Mission 66's worldwide outreach. Head to mission66.org. Mission 66 is made possible through Transworld Radio in partnership with Dr. Luis Sayao.